Well, hello, my fellow scholars, and a very warm welcome to the Exam Study Expert podcast. I'm your host, William Wadsworth, psychologist, study strategy researcher, and full-time study skills coach and speaker. Welcome back to part 2 of the Flashcard Mastery course, the ultimate guide to expert-level flashcard technique, which, as you'll discover today, is the strategy you want to focus on if you have a lot of content to learn and understand for your exams. I know many of you have that exact challenge. So today I want to do two things. So firstly, explaining why flashcards are awesome and why I believe you should definitely have them in your toolkit if your course involves knowing things in any shape or form. As an important piece of perspective on this, I'll also briefly note when we wouldn't want to rely on flashcards, and also why, even if they are our main learning strategy, we'll want to mix in other approaches too, to make sure you're fully prepared and get that rounded prep for all the aspects you need to succeed in your exam. Then second, I want to cover the fundamentals today of good flashcard technique. So what do our cards look like? What are some of the basics we really need to understand if we're going to use the flashcard technique properly? Over the years, I've often asked my coaching clients to screen share or send me photos of their study materials so I can help them optimize their technique. And when I'm looking at a student's flashcards, there's now a kind of mental checklist of fundamental do's and don'ts that I'm running through to make sure that we're setting ourselves up to use the flashcard technique well. And I'm going to cover the big ones in today's episode. So these are the kind of the fundamentals, making sure we're really getting the basics right. Looking a little bit ahead, just to let you know what's coming, parts 3 and 4 of the course in the next couple of weeks to come are going to cover some of the more advanced tips and tricks. So once we've got those basics right, what are some of the extra things we can start to weave in to elevate our game even further and help make our flashcard work even more efficient? As I mentioned in the previous episode of this course, even if you'd consider yourself something of a frequent flyer when it comes to flashcard use, it's well worth making sure you're rock solid on the fundamentals we're covering today. So don't just be tempted to skip this episode and go straight to the more advanced things in part 3 and 4 if you already do flashcards. It's well worth listening today with a critical ear. Perhaps you could even give yourself a kind of mental score out of 10 on each of the best practice points we cover. Where you score anything but a 10, ask yourself how you could get a little better. In some cases, that might not be a complete change of direction, more just taking things you're doing already a little bit further, being a little bit more consistent in good practice. The reason all this matters, many of you listening will end up spending hundreds, if not possibly even thousands of hours making and testing flashcards in your academic career. So even quite a small tweak, making you even a few % more effective each hour, can have an enormous payoff for you in the long run. And just a quick note for novice flashcard users, you are right at home in this course too. I've deliberately set out to make it a start to finish comprehensive experience, everything you need for success contained within these 4 episodes, even if you're completely new to the science of learning. On which note, if you missed last week's part 1 episode, it's well worth going back and taking a listen now so you fully understand the scientific foundations on which the rest of this course is built. So do pause this episode and go back and listen to that one now if you haven't already. So if we're all caught up, let's move on to talk about flashcard best practice. You know all about the power of retrieval practice. That's testing yourself following last week's episode. And you know that there are lots of different ways to do that. Flashcards are a type of retrieval practice. They're not the only way of doing it, but they're a type of retrieval practice called cued recall. Cued recall is characterized by testing yourself on single points in turn. Now, all retrieval practice is testing, and with cued recall, the thing we're testing, the thing we're trying to pull out of our memory, is just a single isolated concept at a time. So we're looking at short, closed-ended questions, typically with a short, black and white, right or wrong kind of answer. In contrast, the other big kind of retrieval practice is free recall. That involves remembering not just a single point in turn, but lots of interconnected points all together. So recalling an entire topic, for instance, rather than just one isolated question from it. When you're putting your study system together, we'll use at least 2, if not 3, of the three main families of effective learning strategy. 2 of those 3 families we just talked about already. That's cued recall through flashcards and free recall. The third family I identify is practice questions, doing realistic exam question practice, whatever that means for your exam. So there's just a little bit of context on the main three families. We've got the cued recall, that's testing yourself on 1 point at a time. Free recall, where you're remembering lots of points altogether, and then doing exam practice questions. This course is all about cued recall through flashcards. Why would we want to do cued recall in particular rather than the other approaches? Well, the real superpower of flashcards and other cued recall strategies is the ability to memorize lots of detailed content in a very time-efficient way. I think they work so well because they're such a pure way of doing your retrieval practice. You get to practice retrieving one specific nugget of information at a time. And even if you get that nugget wrong or you can't remember it, you can reattempt that same card again soon, over and over again as needed until it sticks. Flashcards therefore give you really perfectly dosed practice for every single little item of knowledge in your course. If there's one part that you need to practice 8 times versus mostly you don't even need to practice kind of a couple of times, flashcards allow you to do that. They give you the perfect dose of practice for every single one of the points on your exam. Free recall, when you're remembering lots of points altogether, and the practice exam questions just don't give you that same level of fine control over practice dose for every single point on your exam. So when it comes to just memorizing the fundamental details, flashcards is really the most time-efficient way. Flashcards are also very flexible. Yeah, as we'll talk about, you can learn anything with a flashcard. Numbers, words, concepts, diagrams, whatever you need to learn, you can put it on a flashcard. And finally, it may sound cheesy, but I do think flashcards can even make learning feel fun. Many scholars find a quiet satisfaction in flipping through a deck of paper flashcards or churning through cards on a digital flashcard app, knowing that each time they train with the deck of cards, they're getting better and better. Many games are enjoyable in the wider sense of what a game is. They're enjoyable because they combine some level of challenge with a sense of progress as you gain skill and learn to do things that you previously weren't able to do in that game. Flashcards work in a similar way. They offer some challenge and they offer some sense of progress. And that is what often creates that sense of fun and enjoyment and satisfaction when we're using them. So I believe there's almost always a case for using at least a little of your study time for flashcards. And the case is very clear for a very knowledge-heavy exam with a huge amount to learn. But I'd say even if you're preparing for an exam which has a relatively light knowledge load, maybe it's an English exam where you just need to memorize a few quotes, or a maths exam where you need to memorize a few formulas. Obviously when it comes to success in that English exam or that maths exam, just knowing those quotes or knowing those formulas is only going to be a relatively small portion of what dictates your final mark. It won't get you very far if that's all you can do in the exam. But it's still a very important component to being able to unlock a good mark in that exam. And again, the most effective way to memorize those little details, those quotes or those formulas will be flashcard time. So it won't be most of your study time for that particular exam, but it will be a very important component. On the other hand, for a very knowledge-heavy exam where most of the success in the exam is down to what you know or what you don't know, perhaps you end up spending most of your exam time with flashcards. It's worth saying, though, that even if that's the case, even if your success in your exam is mainly determined by what you know and understand, leading you to focus on flashcards more than anything else, I think it's still important that we spend time on other study strategies. For example, practice exam questions, so that we get experience in applying our knowledge and understanding to the kinds of scenarios you will be faced with in the exam. So broadly, just to kind of synthesize what we've been saying so far, flashcards, really, really important strategy for learning your stuff, learning that fundamental knowledge. And the more your exam demands that you know and understand, and the less it demands kind of sophisticated question answering skills like structuring elaborate essays, the more time we'd allocate over to flashcards. So for many listeners facing challenging exams in high school, university, or careers like medicine, vet med, finance, I know from years and years of talking to you all that the extent to which you know your stuff is often the big determinant of success in your exam. If you know the stuff, you can very likely be able to tackle the questions. And that kind of sense of knowing your stuff, knowing your course content, that's what flashcards are for. They're really powerful stuff. Let's turn now to talk about how we should actually use them. So how should we be using our flashcards? We know why we want to use them. We understand their role. Let's talk about getting the most out of the strategy. Let's start with the basics. What even do we mean by a flashcard? So everything I talk about in this course is really about cued recall strategies. We talked about that a moment ago, of which flashcards is the most common example. But rather than saying cued recall strategies like flashcards every time, I'm just going to say flashcards as a shorthand. whenever I say the word flashcards through this entire course, this covers traditional paper flashcards, where you have a clear cue or prompt on one side and an answer on the back. It also covers many digital quiz or learning platforms, which are essentially digitized versions of flashcards, presenting with you with cues or prompts and inviting you to recall the answer. These are things like Quizlet, Brainscape and Anki, many other platforms like RemNote or Notion, as well as subject-specific platforms, of which there are a bajillion. Cued recall strategies like flashcards also extends to cover my SmartNotes strategy. So SmartNotes, that strategy would come into this course as well as another example of cued recall strategies, and most of the best practice applies to SmartNotes too. If you're not familiar with SmartNotes, I talk about this as a powerful upgrade for regular note making. So if you're someone that likes to write notes, have a look at episode 72 for some more on SmartNotes. So all of these approaches, the paper flashcards, digital flashcards, SmartNotes, these are all united by presenting you with short cues or prompts and inviting you to recall the answer, just one nugget of information at a time. One final fork of the flashcard family comes into play when we consider how we test ourselves with our flashcards. A powerful benefit for all flashcard techniques is that you can use them for self-testing, but they're also a useful resource to give to friends or family members and invite them to test you. I call that pair testing. So the process of making the cards would be exactly the same, but then there are some specific tips for the testing phase when you're getting someone else to test you, and we'll get into the detail on that in part 4 of this course when we talk about more detail on testing yourself, training yourself with your flashcards. A quick note on terminology just before we go further. Words have power, language matters, and some of my language is quite specific and quite deliberate. So a very quick glossary of key terms and why I use them. So you might have already heard me use the word cue or prompt rather than question for what goes on the front of a card. As we'll cover in a moment, it's not necessary to write a full sentence question on the front of your flashcard. So I prefer talking about a prompt going on the front of the card rather than using the word question. Because if I use the word question, many people interpret that to mean a full sentence with a question mark. The word prompt suggests something shorter and crisper, which is what we normally want to be aiming for. In addition, I like to use the word training to refer to the flashcard testing process. I prefer talking about training with your flashcards because it emphasizes that this is the most important part of the process as opposed to just making the flashcards. It's the testing, it's the training that's the real brain workout. That's where we make the real progress with your learning. The word training also has quite a good vibe to it, I feel. For some of us, the word test has kind of slightly unhelpful connotations about trying to get the answer right. And for many of us, tests are to some extent slightly stressful things. We might even use the word test as an adjective, or testing as an adjective, to describe an unpleasant experience, as in, oh, that was a very testing day, or an exasperated teacher or parent might say, oh, you're really testing me today. The word training, on the other hand, has echoes of constant and diligent work ethic, which I really like. There's little judgment on your performance in a training session. You're there to try things out in training. It won't all work out at first. You'll get better over time and with practice. And that kind of angle is really helpful when we think about flashcards, because it emphasizes this idea that all retrieval practice is valuable whether or not we're getting the answer right. So no judgment. For some people, testing might imply it's all about getting the answer right. That unhelpful idea fades when we're thinking about training with our flashcards. So again, I'll use the word training to talk about the testing process. So we've covered why we want to use flashcards, their role, and perhaps some of the slight limitations when you might want to make other choices of study strategy. And we've covered a little on what I mean by a flashcard, what it kind of looks like, and some of the kind of key terminology I use when teaching flashcards. And so we get to really the kind of the meat and potatoes of this episode, the practicalities, getting started with flashcards and other cued recall strategies. So how does it work? Well, the core recipe, if you like, for using flashcards is very simple. It's really just 2 main steps. So let's take a look. Step 1 is making your flashcards. You're writing that series of clear prompts and answers. For paper flashcards, the prompt goes on the front, the answer goes on the back. For digital flashcards, the prompt goes in the question field, the answer goes in the answer field. For SmartNotes, it's prompts down the left-hand column, answers down the right-hand column. If you're new to flashcards, or perhaps want to expand your repertoire of flashcard styles a little, here are some ideas for what you can put on a flashcard. We can put formulas and equations. We can put definitions, terminology, vocabulary. We can put concepts, principles, theories, case studies, examples. We can put data, dates, doses, other numbers. We can put lists of things, so pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, steps in a sequential process, factors affecting a certain point, components of a theoretical framework, symptoms for a particular disease, diagnostic points, even little diagrams, graphs or charts. One of the things I love about flashcards is their flexibility. It's a huge part of their power for me, especially if you're writing them by hand. I can just set my flashcards out any old way I want, anything I want on the back. But many digital flashcard platforms also support different formats, including image prompts. So it's well worth getting to know the capabilities of your chosen platform if you're doing a digital quiz app. So step 1 is making the cards, writing the questions, writing the prompts and their corresponding answers. Step 2 then is the training with your flashcards. So testing yourself by looking at your prompts and trying to recall the corresponding answers. This is the all-important retrieval practice part of the process. After each recall attempt, be sure to check the answer. And if your answer matched, that's great. That helps that point to stick. But if your answer didn't match, that's no problem either. That's also great. That will also help the right answer stick. You'll be more likely to remember that point in future. When we're doing our flashcard training, it's ideally not just a one and done thing. You'd ideally incorporate repetition at both a micro and a macro level. We'll be talking about this more in part 4 of the course. So we want to do micro repetitions in the sense that if you get a point wrong, we ideally want to try it again within that same learning session. And then we want to do macro repetitions in the sense that we want to repeat that whole training exercise. We test ourselves on that whole deck of cards multiple times, spaced out at time intervals. So there's basic 2 steps again. Step 1, we write our cards. Step 2, we train with them. A couple of small variants to mention on these basic 2 steps. So firstly, we might skip that first step entirely if we're using ready-made cards. So often, particularly in the digital world, we can go to some of the digital platforms and the cards will already be written for us, or we have an option to find cards that have already been written for us. Or maybe we've partnered up with a friend or colleague or peer who has either written some cards in its entirety for their course, for your course, and you can just use their cards, or maybe you partner up and divvy up the course and say, okay, I'll write this half of the course, you write that half of the course. Anytime you're using ready-made cards, we can obviously skip the entire step 1. We don't need to spend any time making cards if you're using cards that have already been written. It's still worth reading them through just to check they're of high quality and they all make sense. And you might want to make some additions or tweaks at that point. But essentially, we're talking about skipping straight step 1 and zooming straight into step 2. So that's one of the 2 variants. The second variant applies if you are making your own cards. So if you are making your own cards from scratch, this is a useful little tip, particularly if you're not very familiar with the material. So if it's stuff that's relatively novel or you haven't looked at it for a long time, quite a popular move with my students is to add a preliminary step 0 in which we read through your source material with a highlighter in hand and use it to mark up the key points. After that, we proceed to step 1 as normal. So we go back through the material a second time, but now there's no need to read every word of your source material. You can scan and skip between the key points that you highlighted in the previous step. Every time you find a highlighted point, you turn it into a flashcard, that prompt answer pair. My students often find this accelerates the flashcard making process for them by allowing them to focus fully on the 2 things in turn. So firstly, identifying the key points, that preliminary step 0, before second, turning each of those key points into a prompt and answer pair. The brain often works better and faster when it can focus fully on one kind of thinking in turn. So either reading and finding the key points or making the prompt answer pairs in this example, rather than having to sort of switch back and forth between 2 modes of thinking. Little sidebar on this. A wider pro tip that flows from this is to look out for other opportunities to turn your study process into more of an assembly line in which you do all the similar steps, all the similar thinking tasks together, rather than switching between different kinds of thinking modes the whole time. If you get my study strategy emails, I read a really good example of this idea in action last week when I talked about the tangents list idea. This is a great one for helping you spend less time going down rabbit holes, which I know is a common thing many people ask me about. If you don't get my study strategy Saturday emails, by the way, they're a wonderful thing. A nice bite-sized, high-impact tip to help you stay consistent and make faster progress in your studies. They're quick to read, quick to apply, and quick to make a noticeable difference in your study system. If you'd like to jump in, head head to examstudyexperts.com/Saturday, where you'll also receive a copy of my 6 Pillars of Exam Success cheat sheet to welcome you to the email series. That's examstudyexperts.com/Saturday if you'd like to get on the list for my wonderful Study Strategy Saturday emails. So we now know when to use flashcards, and we know the basics of what we're aiming to do when we are using them. To close out part 2 of this course, I want to cover some important details to watch out for when it comes to using good flashcard technique. So let's start with the tips for step 1 of the process, the 4 essentials of making good flashcards. So number 1, do break it up. I've talked about how cued recall is all about testing yourself on a single point in turn. So a nice way I like to think about what we're aiming for with a given flashcard is how the Greeks thought about a definition of an atom. So the Greek philosopher Democritus reasoned that if you cut matter in half repeatedly, you'd eventually reach something too small to cut in half again. And this was the first definition of an atom. Similarly, we want to atomize our course material to make good flashcards. So we want to break it up, keep cutting it in half and half and half again, such that we have one isolated point on each card, no more, no less. There are exceptions to how far we can go with this. So if it's a list of ideas, if there's like 4 factors, it doesn't make sense to kind of put each of those factors on a separate card, unless you're doing hierarchical cards. We'll talk about in part 3 of the course next week. But there can be exceptions where you still end up with kind of multiple points. If you've got 4 steps in a process or kind of 2 advantages, 2 disadvantages, that would still be one flashcard. But generally speaking, what we're aiming to do is, if you can sensibly break some material up over more cards, that is what we're aiming to do. So the more cards, each of which has the less written on it, the better. Lots of cards, each of which doesn't have very much written on it. Number 2, do make sure you have a clear front and a back if you're using paper flashcards. This may sound incredibly obvious to some of you, but I don't always see this happening, so I want to make the point explicit. A one-sided flashcard is just writing notes, only it happens to be on a small piece of paper. So we really do want that clear prompt on the front and a clear answer on the back. That is essential if we want to do good testing, good retrieval practice when we come on to train with our flashcards. Number 3, don't be too wordy. Aim to avoid full sentences where you can. Again, there are obvious exceptions to this, like if you need to learn exact quotations or a word-for-word definition. But generally speaking, try and trim the language down to the bare minimum to get the point across. And this goes for both the question side, the prompt side, as well as the answer side. And number 4, don't spend too long on the presentation. You want to make your flashcards efficiently so that you have plenty of time for the testing phase, the training phase. Don't spend so long making the cards that we run out of training time. And we're going to be talking about prioritizing the training in more detail in part 4. To finish, a couple of points on training with your flashcards, a couple of basic points on training with your flashcards, and much more detail on this in part 4 of this course. So 2 essential points to bear in mind for best results here. So firstly, don't read your flashcards through right before testing yourself. This is cheating. Again, it may sound obvious to some people, but others, it's part of their process. So try and avoid doing this. Even if it's been a while since we looked at those cards and you don't think you're going to do very well, let's have a go anyway. Try them from memory, see what you can manage, even if it's only kind of getting 5% or 10% right. Have a go, note the answers as well as best you can when you flip the cards over, and try and then have another go at it all again subsequently quite soon. Don't be tempted to just kind of flick through and read them all just before you test yourself, even if it's been a long time. Finally, don't be an early flipper. Be patient. Persevere. Don't flip the card over at the first sign of trouble. Lean into the struggle. Give yourself plenty of time to rummage around in your memory cupboards and see what you can come up with. I talked about this concept in a bit more detail in yesterday's Study Strategy Saturday emails, for those of you that listen regularly. So for this example, can you get the first letter of the word maybe, or have an educated guess? This sort of thing is where the real juice is. There's so much benefit in doing this. This is what often separates the very best flashcard athletes from the rest. So as I say, for more advanced tips on training with your flashcards, we'll be covering that in part 4 of the Flashcard Mastery course, which is coming away in just a couple of weeks' time. But before then, I hope to have your company next week for part 3, when we'll be tackling advanced tips for making your flashcard. Hacks to get mostly achieve one of two things: either reducing the time it takes you to make your cards so you can get to the all-important training stage more quickly, or we've got some tips to set up your cards to make the knowledge a bit stickier, to help build your understanding with tools to crack the trickier elements of your course and memorize those tricky little corners that are sometimes a bit hard to learn. Just before I leave you today, I have a little parish announcement for you. The Exam Study Expert podcast is coming to Patreon. So if you're not familiar with Patreon, it's a platform to support content creators, a little way for people who find value in content like this show to show their appreciation and to support keeping the show going and growing into the future. My promise to you is that every penny and every cent raised through Patreon will go back into the costs associated with making and hosting the podcast and the website that accompanies it at examstudyexpert.com. Any surplus beyond that, if we're lucky enough to get to that point, will go 50-50 to high-impact environmental and educational charities. And there'll be opportunities for my patrons to vote on the specific causes we'll be supporting. And this isn't just an empty promise. I'm going to do an annual report every anniversary of this announcement, so April the 20th, itemising what we spent on the show versus what came in from Patreon supporters, and if appropriate, which causes benefited from any surplus we made in that year. But really more than that, I also want to do a lot to reward my patrons. So expect great exclusive and bonus content to help you go further and deeper in learning to study smarter. One thing I'm especially excited about offering today is early access to new podcast episodes. And right now, that includes early access to this entire 4-part Flashcard Mastery course. So if you're as crazy about learning effectively as I am, and if you've enjoyed the first 2 installments and are looking forward to the next 2, don't wait another 2 weeks to get your hands on the advanced tips to level up your flashcard making and training. You can get the entire course right away today when you become an Exam Study Expert supporter on Patreon. You can check out the link in the show notes or visit examstudyexpert.com/Patreon. It's a great way to give back to the show and show us some support, as well as get access to some fantastic benefits to help you studying smarter. Thank you in advance to those who support the show. And thank you to you all for listening today. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I will look forward to seeing you back very soon for part 3, and when we'll be getting to those advanced tips for making your flashcards. Thanks once again, and wishing you every success, as always, in your studies.